Welcome. Today we are going to take a brief look at the real St. John of the Ladder. A little bit of the biography and a little bit of his thoughts, really, when it comes to ethical issues. How do you overcome what's known as the passions, those instincts and drives that you have in your life? And his main work to contribute to that, the ladder of divine ascent. We'll see how this matches up with Kierkegaard's use of the pseudonym and what relationship these two have together. As you recall, Kierkegaard used lots and lots of pseudonyms. His works are prolific with them. In fact, even when he signed what looks like his name, it was still a pseudonym as Kierkegaard. In fact, most of his pseudonyms were not real people. They were just hints towards the average Copenhager or the attentive one, or plays on themes like constant conscientis, right? This idea of ever repeating in the work of repetition. Only Johannes Climacus and possibly SK, if we're to see that as himself, were real people. So why did he pick this monk, St. John of the Ladder? Who was he? And what connection does he have to philosophy and to the philosophy of Kierkegaard? Anti-Climacus is also a reference to him as well. And he's the author of other works like Sickness unto Death and Practice in Christianity. Kierkegaard also wrote, I count myself higher than Johannes Climacus, but lower than Anti-Climacus. Likely, this is the character he has in his work, and not the real Johannes Climacus, or St. John of the Ladder. The historical St. John of the Ladder was one of those early advocates for a method of prayer and practice, spirituality, if we'd like to use this in a broader term, called hesychism. He lived 579 to 649, a contemporary of another Christian advocate for hesychism by the name of St. Maximus the Confessor. Both John and Maximus lived pretty much the exact same time, shortly after the zenith, or at the very zenith, of the later Roman Empire. Justinian's reign ended in 565, and they're both born about 15 years later. And both will live and see the collapse, in many ways, of the empire in the loss of three of the seats of Christianity, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Both become monastics in North Africa. Technically, Sinai is not North Africa, but it's close enough. And both of them are prolific writers, at least in some respects, on the issues and controversies of their day. And both have their spiritual connection to notions of hesychism. Both will also be influencers of St. Gregory of Palamas, the 14th century champion of hesychism. Palamas, in many ways, would have been a better use of pseudonym for Kierkegaard. After all, he addresses the issue of how is it that you can know the unknown, which is really the theme for this first work. Palamas enters into this giant confrontation with Barlaam of Calabria, who is the teacher of people like Petrarch, the father of humanism. Barlaam says we can't learn anything, not at least about the unknown. Well, Palamas says that we have to, and that we might not know the unknown, God in his essence, but we can know God in his energies. In his major work, The Triads, is writing against this, an idea that you can't learn anything. And in many ways, Kierkegaard should have looked at Gregory of Palamas and said, I like his ideas. I'm going to borrow him for my use of this pseudonym, because at least this applies to this work, to the philosophical fragments, to the idea of can the truth be learned? And he's not just picking any random hesychist. He could have gone back to early hesychists like St. Anthony the Great, and he wouldn't have been able to write about later hesychists like St. John the Hesychist, who's a 20th century example, obviously, of Kierkegaard being in the 19th. But this is a practice of hesychism that he has a very long history that's existent during Kierkegaard's life. Was it the teaching of hesychism or something else about St. John of the Ladder that Kierkegaard gravitated towards? Little is known why Kierkegaard chose the name St. John of the Ladder, Johannes Climacus, to go with the language he was speaking. It could be that we know very little about St. John's actual life, that there's a certain mystery and intrigue about this man. He's more than just an unnamed monk because he lived and we have a writing of his. We know he was likely born in Constantinople and around the age of 16 will go off and join St. Catherine's Monastery, which is at the base of Mount Sinai. This monastery is world famous. It's one of the oldest monasteries in existence. And while surrounded by Islam, it remains a Christian monastery, in part because it's got the only piece of writing from the hand of Muhammad still in existence. A note that Muhammad said to leave this area off limits. And so it's continued, and it exists and it thrives on its own. It's the seat of where the commandments would have been given by Moses, which is why the monastery grew up around there. It's out in the middle of nowhere. It's quiet, it's isolated. And yet there's a small but thriving monastic community that's been there for nearly 2,000 years. Even when John was at the monastery, little is known about him there. He would study and learn until the abbot that he was learning from died, and then he went out into the desert and settled down in Thola, or a wild place, where he'll spend a very long period of his life in isolation, prayer, and repentance. And key to his understanding of life were notions of tears of penance during this time. After a long period in solitary asceticism, he was chosen to be the next abbot in charge of the monastery. His age is a little questionable at this point, but he was likely a very old man compared to how long he had left to live. He will govern the monastery for about 4 years, and during his time he was requested to write a guide for those entering monastic life. While he might feel unworthy of this task, he submitted and wrote the work that gives him the name that we know him by, of the Ladder of Divine Ascent, therefore St. John of the Ladder, or Climacus, going to that Latin term. The Ladder of Divine Ascent was written at the request of another abbot who wanted him to write down whatever was necessary for salvation for monks. St. John relented and wrote this work. And so anyone who was a monk would be able to learn of the struggles to achieve union with God, to achieve theosis. And while the audience is definitely monastics, this has become a standard book read by Orthodox Christians over Lent for the next 1,500 or so years. Now, not everyone reads it, but it's there because it's got practical purposes in helping you overcome the passions, the challenges that you face in your life. It serves as a basic ethical treatise for those who want to advance in their life and overcome those passions. It consists of 30 steps or rungs leading to spiritual perfection. Step 1 is the complete renunciation of the world, which is a logical step if you're a monk and a little bit harder if you're not. Step 30 is love. Ultimately, this is the goal. It is also one of the first books to be printed with the printing press, as it was a popular devotional work, not only for monks, but for the laity as well. There's usually an icon associated with this work, and it will show monks and priests ascending the ladder to God. They are also getting pulled down by demons through the aids of the passions, and yet are encouraged also by heavenly hosts trying to say, you can do it, you can make it, ascend the heights, right? There's this large path being done. So let us spend a little bit of time on a few of these steps to understand this process. We won't start on the first step since most of you aren't going to become monks, and that isn't the aim and the goal here. But looking at these practical issues that can help you in your own life. Step 8 is on freedom from anger and on meekness. He states, as the gradual pouring of water on a fire completely extinguishes the flame, so the tears of true mourning are able to quench every flame of anger and irritability. Freedom from anger is therefore victory over nature and insensibility to insults acquired by struggles and sweat. Meekness is an immovable state of the soul which remains unaffected whether in evil report or in good report, in dishonor or in praise. So brings us to a very simple question. Can you be angry and humble at the same time? Can you be meek and hold anger towards others? Can you be personally angry at being wronged? Maybe there's room for the wrongs done to another and being humble. But broadly speaking, the answer is no, not really. That freedom of anger begins with being meek, with looking at yourself and being humble. And therefore, when others do wrong, you're not going to lash out against them. Continuing in 4, he says, the beginning of freedom from anger is silence of the lips. When the heart is agitated, in the middle is silence of the thoughts. When there is mere disturbance of the soul, and the end becomes an imperturbable calm under the breath of unclean winds. Like we've heard before, many of us over and over again, when you're angry, count to 3 before responding. Right? This is something that's being advocated here by St. John. Stop, reflect, take a breath, be silent. Don't speak so fast when your heart is agitated. The first step in being free from anger is not to react to it immediately, to try to slow down your process, which is easier said than done, and only is going to happen through patience and practice. Then we can silence the thoughts that disturb us. And finally, you will be calm. St. John also points out what anger actually is. And this is a concept that's a little hard to get, a little frustrating for many of us, maybe too. St. John says, anger is a reminder of hidden hatred, which sounds a little harsh, right? Anger is a reminder of a hidden hatred. That is to say, a remembrance of wrongs. Anger is a desire for the injury of the one who has provoked you. When you're angry, there's some sort of hidden hatred. You have wronged me. Therefore, there's a problem that needs to be dealt with. I'm frustrated with you. I hate that I can't do what I want, and you become that object. Again, this is rather difficult for us to accept, but it's really hard to reject too. That idea that anger is a reminder of some sort of hidden hatred. When you're angry, is it because you're remembering the wrongs that others have committed against you? Right? You're not loving when you're angry. You're not forgiving. And if you stop and look at your own life, who are you the most angry with? More often than not, it's not the stranger. It's those that you love. Any of you have any brothers or sisters? Do you love them? Why is it that they're usually the ones that make you the most angry? I mean, their actions definitely have a role, but they also know exactly where to push those buttons, don't they? They know exactly where your weaknesses are. They know exactly where you don't feel comfortable. They serve as a mirror to your own faults. They show you where you're not good. And that's problematic. Maybe the hidden hatred isn't at them, but at your own faults. Are you always angry with them, or is some of the time that you're just angry with yourself? That you didn't want to reflect on your faults, but they're showing it to you. Maybe not in a very kind way. Maybe they're making sure you notice it, but maybe that's what they're doing. Are you angry with them because they demonstrate your misplaced affections in things and objects? Because they show you how selfish you can be, or are they just maybe unlovable jerks? Maybe it's just them. St. John continues, though we know very many intolerable fruits of anger, we have found only one, its involuntary offspring, which though illegitimate is nevertheless useful. Right? What is the outcome here? What is the value that can come out of this problem? He says he has seen people flaring up madly and vomiting their long-stored malice, who by their very passion were delivered from passion, and who have obtained from their offender either penance or an explanation of the long-standing grievance. I've seen others who have seemed to show a brute patience, but who are nourishing resentment within them under the cover of silence. Right? Is it so possible, indeed, to be angry with someone that you confront them and you rid your anger of that issue forever? Many of us have different stories in our life where we're so angry with somebody and we blow up at them, and then it goes away. We're done. No reason to be angry anymore. He continues and addresses the issues of anger and sensuality. Now, sometimes we're angry not just because somebody is a mirror, but because of a disposition that needs to be worked on. He says, when for some reason I was sitting outside a monastery near the cells of those living in solitude, I heard them fighting by themselves in their cells, like caged partridges from bitterness and anger, and leaping at the face of their offenders as if they were actually present. Have you ever yelled and freaked out at somebody who isn't there? Your anger with them just seethes in you as you flail out, thinking about something or recollecting something, or that you're acting crazed. And he said he is the one in charge, as the abbot, devoutly advised them not to stay in solitude in case they should be changed from human beings into demons. Right? Sometimes if you can't sit and be good in your own self, if you're always thinking of disasters and those who have wronged you, that maybe you need a distraction. Maybe you need to be around others. Maybe you need some encouragement from other people. He says that he has also observed people who are sensual and corrupt in heart and are sometimes meek, what you might call flatterers, familiar, fond of outward show. And I advise these to go and adopt a life of solitary, using this as a cure for sensuality and corruption of heart, lest from rational beings they should be pitifully changed into irrational animals. irrational animals is a little bit better than being turned into demons, but both of which you've lost your humanity. But when some of them told me that they were wretched victims of these two passions, anger and sensuality, I absolutely forbade them to live according to their own will. But in a friendly way, I suggested to their superiors that they should allow them sometimes to live in one way, sometimes to live in another way, but that they should be entirely subject to the superior. You know this, and we've encountered this idea before, that different people are struck differently and need different solutions to their problems. Some people are angry and need somebody there to cool them off. That they need to remember that they need other people. Others, though, their main faults are being sensual. They're flatterers. They want everyone to be paying attention to them. There's issues of pride in both of these. You're angry because your pride has been hurt. Your pride makes you want the love and attention from everybody instead of being comfortable by yourself. So what do? The solution, according to St. John, is that you need a guide. You need somebody to help you along the way, a mentor, a spiritual father, a spiritual mother, somebody who's not just a friend, although friends could be helpful, but somebody who will say, here's how you should live. And they know you enough and you respect them enough that you can learn from that. There's this key idea to our morality that we need to be treated as individuals, that there's not a one-size-fits-all problem. And yet, how do you know? Because usually if we're left to our own devices, we'll probably go the easiest way and we'll either be turned into demons or irrational beasts, neither of which is what we're wanting out of our life. Climacus tells us that if we are observant, we shall see many irritable people are practicing vigils, fasts, and silence. Right? That there's a lot of people who have their passions inflamed while doing pious activities. It says, for the aim of the demons is to suggest to them, under the pretext of penance and mourning, just what is likely to increase their passion. Sometimes you're doing an act that outwardly is a good thing, and you know that this is the way to fake it till you make it, but maybe sometimes you're there and you're judging those around you, or you're growing even more irritable and angry and sensual with the very moment. You're fasting and all you can think about is food. You're at a vigil and all you're thinking about is yourself. Climacus also asks us to do something that is really outside of where most of us would feel comfortable with, and our society doesn't really encourage this sort of idea too much, and that's accepting dishonor. He says the beginning of blessed patience is to accept dishonor with sorrow and bitterness of the soul. That you're going to be patient, you're going to have to take what others are launching against you, even if it's not okay. So the middle stage is therefore to be free from pain in the midst of these things. And perfection, if possible, is to regard dishonor as praise. Let the first rejoice, let the second be strong, let the third is blessed, for he exults in the Lord. And we can think of those who have fought righteous fights, who accepted dishonor and didn't lash back and didn't attack, even though they were justified to do so. And usually for those people who exulted, who regarded dishonor as praise, said, you know what, you're attacking me because I'm right, because this cause is righteous, and you don't like that. We view these people as great, not easy, but as heroes for a cause. He then continues and says, I once saw 3 monks receive the same injury at the same time. One felt the sting of this, but kept silent. The second rejoiced at his injury for his reward it would bring him, but was sorry for the wrongdoer. And the third, thinking of the harm his erring neighbor was suffering, wept fervently. And fear, reward, and love were to be seen at work. Right? We have 3 different ways that we could accept dishonor. We can just keep quiet but burn in anger. Or we could feel sad for that person who's making us the laughingstock, making us the dishonorable one, making us seem like we're somehow in the wrong, but you're not. I mean, I'm thinking a lot of this in my mind of, civil rights movement and those peaceful protests of sit-ins, right? I'm going to sit here and you're going to launch attacks at me and I'm not going to fight back. I feel sorry for you that you're so close-minded and want to hate just based on skin or anything else. You can be angry. There's good cause to be angry. But looking upon them with pity, or even more so, the whole idea of weeping for the sins of others, for them being selfish, right? That this is the best option according to Climacus, to actually feel sorry for their mistakes, and not with the self-righteous sort of way of, well, if you were as good as me, but having this actual, true, deep down sorrow that their sins are limiting their life, that their anger, their misplaced aggression towards you is making their life less beneficial. We can ask ourselves, what's better, to be silent or weep for others? And why? Some of us might think we're going to end up only being a punching bag for others. Or would you just end up not worrying about it? I mean, these could be really your 2 possible outcomes of accepting dishonor in this way. Maybe you can realize that they already have their punishment, right? Justice has been served, and you have to be you. That's worse than anything I could say or do to you. I'm not going to not worry about it. I'm going to feel sorry for you because you have to be you. And again, that is a judgment. That is something that changes how we would look at things. What would you gain from accepting this perspective? And how would this change how we would treat other people overall? What's the moral standard that we would be expecting to live up to? This is clearly beyond what Kant would advocate or anybody else, because this is over and above. But at the same time, we can see where it's rooted and where it's coming from, and that there's a larger perspective at work here, and maybe even one that helps us move forward with our lives. On step 9, he moves forward and addresses the remembrance of wrongs. He asks us, why do we remember the wrongs that others have committed against us? What benefit does that actually serve for us? What do you actually gain when you remember when others have hurt you? Possibly you know that you're going to avoid getting hurt in the same way, but that's not the same thing as remembrance of wrongs. It's not, okay, yeah, you're not a trustworthy person, or you like to hurt me and I should move away from you, right? That's not the same thing. When we're thinking about remembrance of wrongs, we're thinking of festering over what others have done against you. What does Climacus identify as the remembrance of wrongs? He says it's the consummation of anger, the keeper of sins, hatred of righteousness, ruin of virtues, poison of the soul, worm of the mind, shame of prayer, stopping of supplication, the estrangement of love, a nail stuck in the soul, pleasureless feeling, beloved, in the sweetness of bitterness, continuous sin, unsleeping transgression, and an hourly malice. None of these are very positive. We don't have a lot that we can take from this remembrance of wrongs. In fact, he says this dark and hateful passion, I mean remembrance of wrongs, is one of those that are produced but have no offspring. What does he mean by this? There's no benefit that comes out of it, no possible turn that you can get by remembering the wrongs that others have done to you, or to even other people. Right? Anger, you might eventually blow up and then realize, okay, this was a small and insignificant thing that I overworked in my own mind, or I've overstepped, and now we can both apologize to each other. But with remembrance of wrongs, it's just yourself. It's just things eating you. It's not like there's a good that can come from it, like even some of the other passions. It's like drinking poison and hoping the other person will die. It's not productive. It only, in fact, is going to harm you. He says, he who has obtained love has banished revenge, but he who nurses enmities stores up for himself endless sufferings. You're the only person who suffers by remembering the wrongs. The person who caused the wrongs, the person who's causing you this distress, doesn't affect them at all. But it does affect you. So remove this passion from your life is what Climacus is urging his fellow monks to do. He says, the remembrance of wrongs is an interpreter of Scripture of the kind that adjusts the words of the Spirit to its own views. Let it be put to shame by the prayer of Jesus, right? That Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, which cannot be said with it. It's, again, very hard to remember the sins of others when you're asking for mercy for yourself. You cannot have remembrance of wrongs and say the Jesus prayer at the same time. You cannot genuinely hold a grudge and ask for mercy. Otherwise, you're not actually asking for mercy. You're asking, hey, forgive me, I'm doing great. That guy over there, let's get him, right? That's not the attitude of mercy. And that's what you're trying to foster with this rational love, this love of the Spirit of God. This is the overcoming of the passions. This is the basis of this ethical system. And once again, he says, you will know that you have completely got rid of this rot. Not when you pray for the person who has offended you, nor when you exchange presents with him, nor when you invite him to your table, but only when, on hearing that he has fallen into spiritual or bodily misfortune, that you suffer and weep for him as you would for yourself. Right? That is when you no longer remember the wrongs, when you actually decide to love this person. And there's a lot of steps for most of us along this way. Right? Okay, I'll pray for you. I don't really like you, but I'll pray for you. Or, all right, let me at least give you something. I'll have an outward show that you and I are at peace. Or I'll even invite you over. And maybe I'll learn to tolerate your presence instead of just seething with hatred. The real step, the goal of all of this is, again, this beloved community. When you hear that they'll even fall, and you won't just have this little glint of like, oh yeah, finally came to them, good job. But you'll weep over that instead. Step 18, Climacus moves on to the issue of insensibility. Unlike other philosophies that try to help you to overcome the passions, such as Buddhist notions of nirodha, or complete detachment, getting rid of all attachments to anybody and anything, one's cravings, clingings, etc. Hesychism has the opposite push. Climacus points out that we need to be hypersensible, not insensible. We have to decide if we want to weep for the sins of our enemies or ignore them. We can't sit on the fence with this one. It's not okay or comfortable. We can't be partially sensitive to these issues. Otherwise, it'll only result in our own pain and our own damnation. So which one? Complete detachment or increased sensitivity? Which one is the one really that you should do? This is a very clear difference between Christian hesychism and Buddhist notions on what we should be striving for to overcome our passions. Climacus doesn't really leave a lot of room for doubt. He says that insensibility, both in the body and in the spirit, is a deadening feeling, which from long sickness and negligence lapses into loss of feeling. That insensibility is negligence that has become habit. Right? There's a power of habit that Aristotle and others talk about, that there's advantage of building good habits, but insensibility, according to Climacus, is negligence that grows into a habit. It's a negative habit. It's going to cause you ruin instead of flourishing. Furthermore, he says, he who has lost sensibility is a brainless philosopher, a self-condemned commentator, a self-contradictory windbag, a blind man who teaches others to see. His mouth prays against his passion, and his body struggles for it. He philosophizes about death, but he behaves as if he was immortal. All the time he is his own accuser, and he does not want to come to his senses. I will not say he cannot, but that if you've become insensitive, Climacus says that you don't really want to come to your senses. He says you can, it's in your ability, but you have decided that you don't do this. Finally, he concludes, as far as my poor powers of knowledge allow, I have exposed the wiles and wheels of this stony, obstinate, raging, and stupid passion. Right? That you need to grow your sensibilities and your sensitivities to others, that this is the way to love. And love means caring about those, even when it is going to harm you. So today we spent a little bit of time on the life and the major work of St. John of the Ladder, the work being the Ladder of Divine Ascent. The only real pseudonym that is based on a real person from Soren Kierkegaard. Now, the question is still before us at the end of the discussion. What about St. John of the Ladder told Kierkegaard that he needed to borrow from it? The Ladder of Divine Ascent is helping us to overcome the passions. It's an ethical system that's very much grounded in the instructions that St. John is giving his fellow monastics. Kierkegaard liked to see himself a little bit as a monastic. He really liked the idea of creating his own little monastic community in his home. And in many ways, he used his wealth to kind of create his cloister. There's no vow of poverty, but instead money had lost its meaning because he just spent it. He used it, he utilized it. And he tried to overcome the temptations in his life in a different way than you would find at the Sinai desert, as St. John of the Ladder did. And probably more important than even the work or the life of St. John of the Ladder is this image of climbing a ladder, is this idea of ascending the heights. When constructing a work on can the truth be learned, there's a lot of other hesychists and monks in general or real life examples that spent a lot more time addressing the question of can the truth be learned. But what we see with St. John of the Ladder is it's not just about can the truth be learned, but how do you scale the height to learning the truth? That first rung of the ladder, to abandon everything, is really a step much more than most of us can take. It's the reason why we're not monastics. But maybe that's also the reason why Kierkegaard talked about the fact that he's not quite like Johannes Climacus, that he's not able to do this early on in his life. And then in the later works, he talks about anti-Climacus, best read and understood as later Climacus, higher on that ladder. He says he's above Climacus but below anti-Climacus, that he's not at the height, that he can't scale that high. But while he can't reach the notion of love, he can battle with the temptations in his own life, and maybe that's what the root of this all is. It's also possible, for amongst other reasons, that the latter metaphor is really what he was after, and trying to borrow this in his larger confrontations with Hegel, and trying to argue against the idea of the world Geist unforming and creating one thing and another. In fact, there's lots of different arguments on who the Johannes Climacus in this work is when we get into his actual life and that unfolding. Because it's definitely not the life of St. John of the Ladder that Soren Kierkegaard presents as this young man, Johannes Climacus. In many ways it resembles him, but maybe it's an idealized version. Maybe, again, St. John is nothing other than the man he aspires to be, that he wants to climb, that he wants to ascend the heights, and yet there's always that leap that has to be done first, where you do have to abandon some of what you know, because you don't know everything, and you know you don't know everything. So it requires this leap. It requires doubting everything, and yet throwing yourself on the task at hand to eventually being able to get to that rung to love